Hi and welcome to my channel. I want to talk to you today in this video a little bit more detail about acquiring a Z visa or a work visa in China, or to put it another way, how you can come to China to work and earn income. To get into some specifics of the work visa, which is called the Z visa. And I also, in this video, are going to talk a little bit about ways that people work in China without a Z visa. And I want to say at the outset that I'm not endorsing those methods, not endorsing anyone breaking the law, but I do want to inform you about how some people do work in China without the Z visa. This process may seem complicated. I will tell you up front, having gone through the Z visa process several times here, it's a paperwork hassle. It's not an easy thing to do. The more detail-oriented you are, and the more information you have, the easier it is to make the process go smoothly. That being said, you may encounter and probably will encounter frustrations along the way. That is the nature of any bureaucratic interaction with anybody in China. There's always going to be frustrations. In general, though, the rule of thumb in Asia is where there's a will, there's a way. If a company has offered you a position and they want you to come to China and they are confident they can get you a work visa, chances are they'll be able to get you into the country and get you working without a big problem. So without further ado, I want to talk a little bit about the documents you'll need and the process itself. This is a bit boring. I plan to do some future videos about life here in Chengdu. You can see Chengdu behind me. And I'll certainly do that. But I do want to give you some of the more technical information. So please bear with me to the end of the video, and you'll get some good info. So without further ado, let me talk a little bit about the Z visa. So I want to talk a little bit about the requirements for a Z visa. I'm going to speak primarily about teaching visas and what qualifies for a Z visa for teaching, but it's similar in any industry. But the most common reason that someone comes to China, or the most common work that a native English speaker would do, would be teaching. So I'll focus a little bit more on that. The first requirement is you do have to be a university graduate and hold a bachelor's degree in order to qualify for a work visa in China. For teaching, very likely you will need either a TEFL or TESOL certification. TEFL is teaching English as a foreign language. TESOL is the same thing. It's teaching English as a second language. They're just called different things in different countries. You can obtain a TEFL or TESOL certification online, taking like a 120-hour course that's fairly inexpensive, a few $100s US, and generally pretty easy to complete. Very often for teaching jobs that will be a requirement, especially if the teaching job is teaching English. This is the one that is sometimes difficult for younger folks. You do need to have 2 years of postgraduate work experience in the field that you are applying for. And so you need to be able to show evidence that you worked for 2 years. So if you are just a recent college graduate, that's obviously going to be very, very challenging to do, because your graduation date might be 2015. And you're applying in 2017. If it's a full 2 years after your date of graduation, for example, I'm making this video in mid-May, so maybe you just graduated in May of 2015 and you just got your 2 years experience under your belt, you could apply. If you graduated in 2016 and you're applying for a job in China in 2017, it's going to be very difficult to prove that you've had 2 years postgraduate experience since you haven't graduated for a year. So working on a Z visa in China is something that generally you can only do if you're a few years out of college. Now, you also need to have no evidence of a criminal background in your home country. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the criminal background check in a little while. But if you spent some time in prison, if you were convicted of a serious crime that shows up on a police record, then you are probably not going to get yourself a Z visa. When you get to China, you're generally going to have to do a medical check. And so you have to be reasonably healthy with no chronic debilitating illnesses, no sexually transmitted diseases, no evidence of drug use, or a documented history of mental illness. Probably also will disqualify you for a Z visa. All right, so those are the general requirements for a Z visa. Again, most of those requirements are true for any sort of work in China. The TEFL, TESOL, more for teaching English. What will you need in order to get a Z visa? And the documentation is rather difficult. And I want to preface this by saying that a lot of this documentation is frankly stupid and unnecessary. But one of the things about China that's very different is that there's check boxes to be checked in anything you do, and a lot of paperwork. And even if that paperwork is often not important, it still must be done. And so that's one of the things you learn living here very quickly, is that there's what I used to call, or still call, a rigmarole, if you're familiar with that word, of just stuff you have to do, even though it seems pointless. So you're going to need your university diploma, and you're going to need more and more a transcript. This is new, and it's going to vary from province to province in China, but it's worthwhile, since you're doing all this stuff anyway, to just get the transcript in case you need it. It's better to go into a visa appointment with more documents than you need, rather than have, you go all the way to the consulate and they say, where is your blah, blah, blah? And you say, oh, I didn't bother with that. And they say, well, you need it. Get out of line and go home. So your college diploma and your transcript, both of those you should get notarized, and then apostilled, and then certified by the Chinese embassy or consulate in your home country. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what an apostille is, because you may not be familiar with that term. I know I wasn't the first time I heard it. You also need a CV, or for my American listeners, viewers, a resume showing 2 years postgraduate relevant work experience. In China, they tend to use the European CV, curriculum vitae, as opposed to resume, so just get used to saying CV. That resume has to show your 2 years postgraduate relevant work experience, right? Make sure that it shows it clearly on the resume. You also need a criminal background check, notarized and apostilled, and then again certified by the Chinese embassy or consulate in your home country. And again, that's 3 documents that you're going to need notarized and apostilled. So I'll talk about how you do that. And generally, it's a good idea to have a recommendation letter from the previous employers on their company letterhead. And they say with the seal of the company. In America and in England, we typically don't have company seals. In China, every company is issued by the government a red stamp. So that's sort of what they're used to. But something on company letterhead that looks official from a previous employer, documenting that you worked in the field for 2 years. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the criminal background check and the apostille. As an American, I'm going to speak about this from an American perspective. It's slightly different and frankly probably easier in other countries than in the United States to accomplish this. So for the United States, the criminal background check they're looking for is from the local police station where you live. So if you go into your local police station, assuming that you haven't recently moved, that your last several years have been at one location, or your hometown, for example, if you're someone who recently graduated from college but maybe has gone back to live with their parents, don't worry about the 4 years you were in college. Just go to your hometown. If you've been living in the same place for a long time, just go there. If you've recently moved, like within the last year or two, go back to the previous place that you used to live, and go to that local police station, pay them, anywhere from, I'm sure, $5 to $40 for a proof of no criminal record. Now, here's the joke part. As they may tell you when they look at you strangely for asking for such a document, a criminal background check from a local police department in the United States only shows crimes that you committed or were convicted of in that municipality. So if you're like most Americans and you're from a small municipality, a small town, they will tell you this doesn't really show you anything. You do not need a Justice Department or FBI background check. That is very expensive and very time consuming, and the Chinese government doesn't require it. The Chinese government asks for this criminal background check because they make the false assumption that the United States and China are similar in terms of the structure of how they sort of monitor or keep track of people. And in China, as you'll learn, every Chinese citizen is given what's called a hukou, which is essentially their home town, home district, home village, home neighborhood. And it's very hard to change your hukou. So if you meet someone in Beijing who's working there, but they say, oh, I'm actually from, Shenzhen, or I'm actually from Guangzhou or some other city in China, chances are they're actually a migrant worker. They actually don't have a license to live in Beijing, and they're renting an apartment short term. If they run into serious medical problems, or if they run into if they want to get married, they've actually got to go back to their hometown and do it, because that's where all of their records are kept. For some reason, the Chinese government assumes the same thing about the United States, and so they require this stupid local police station check that means nothing. Literally, in the United States, if you live in, say, Massachusetts, in Springfield, Massachusetts, currently, and you've lived there for the last 10 years, and in Worcester, Massachusetts, which isn't too far away, you committed a heinous crime and spent 5 years in jail, that wouldn't show up on the Springfield, Massachusetts criminal background check. So it doesn't prove anything. So anyway, just do it. Don't ask for why. Now, you have that criminal background check with the seal of your local police department in your hand. You go to your local notary public. I'm sure most people know what a notary public is, and you get it notarized. You pay your money and get that notary stamp on that document. Okay. Now is the next step, step 3, which you may be unfamiliar with. You're going to go to your local state government, or in other countries, potentially provincial government, not really sure, and look up an apostille and figure out how to get it in your local state. I did this in the state of Connecticut, and it involved me sending the notarized criminal background check in an envelope, certified mail, to Hartford, Connecticut, the capital, to the Department of the State, where they have an office that does apostilles. What is an apostille? Well, you know what a notary is? A notary is somebody who has been trained to certify a document as official. Well, who certifies the notaries? And that's the Department of the State in the United States. And so the Department of the State has an office that certifies and trains notaries. You're essentially sending the notarized document to that office for them to look at the notary's number and stamp and say, yes, as the state of Connecticut or the state of Indiana or the state of Florida, we are certifying or apostilling this notary as a true and honest notary that we have certified. So they're essentially saying the notary is real. So, and the reason you haven't heard of this too much is that a notary in the United States is a notary, and there's no reason to prove that they're a real notary. We just trust they are. You're applying for a position in a different country, for a visa in a different country, and they don't know what that notary actually means. Is it real? Is it fake? Right? So now you get this pretty stamp from your state government. Now, when I say Department of the State, I'm not saying the State Department. Please don't get confused. The State Department is like, Rex Tillerson right now, right? So that's, you don't need him to certify it. You need your local Department of the State to do that. Now, and this is the part that I've had folks get confused about, now that you've proven that the notary is real, you now have to prove that the apostille is real. And the way you do that is you take the apostilled letter to your local Chinese embassy or consulate, the one that supervises your area of the United States. I believe there's about 4 or 5 in the U.S. Pretty easy to find which one to go to. For example, if living in the Northeast, you go to New York. If you live in the mid-Atlantic, you'd go to Washington, D.C. to the Chinese embassy. Chicago, Los Angeles, there's one down south as well somewhere. So you go to that local Chinese consulate, have the apostilled letter notarized by the consulate. Now, I want to just give you the background of this. I feel that when people understand the process, it will make more sense. The Chinese government doesn't understand how legal documents in the United States work. So the government in Beijing doesn't really have, they may have somebody who knows because they lived in America, but they don't know in an official way. So when you present a document to them that shows a criminal background check, and it's got all these fancy American stamps on it, in the same way that if you were to look at a bunch of official Chinese stamps, it wouldn't make any sense to you. This could be fake. This could, be just made up in someone's garage. The duty of the Chinese embassy in the United States is to understand the legal government processes within the United States. So they have experts in the consulates who will then look at that apostille and say, yes, we know, because we're here and it's what we're paid to do, that this is an official apostille from this state. We have a picture of it somewhere, and we know who the Secretary of the State is, and that is their signature, and we're all set. So essentially, it's going through, you're getting it from your local police station, the initial document, you're getting it notarized, you're going the additional step for an apostille, and then the additional step of having the Chinese government in the United States or in England or in Australia certify to the Chinese government in China that this is correct and proper. Okay, so again, it's a bit of a long-winded explanation, but I want to make sure that you understand why this process is being done, and that will make sure that you do it. I've had situations where people have come to China and they didn't quite understand what it was they were doing, and so they said, well, I don't really need the Chinese embassy to do that. That's just an extra step. That is absolutely a requirement. You cannot have it done in China. The Chinese government here will look at it and say, we don't know what the hell this is. So, very important. Now, I do suggest that you rinse and repeat this process for your diploma and for your transcript. Now, to talk a little bit about transcripts, you might be saying, but wait a minute, John, I've sent transcripts places before. You have two types of transcripts, official and unofficial. An official transcript is sent to the person who asked for it in a sealed envelope. And that's why it's official. You haven't tampered with it. You haven't printed it up on your computer and put a fancy stamp on it. Absolutely correct. But you're not going to be able to get your college to send an official transcript to China. So the Chinese government, again, even though it's not an official transcript, they want to see a transcript more and more, again, depending on the province. It's worth going through the process. Go down to your university or send them an email and say, please send me an unofficial transcript. They will send you your transcript. Get that notarized. The notary will say, but this is an unofficial transcript. Say, yeah, I'm moving to China. Notarize it, damn it. They'll notarize it, apostille it, Chinese embassy. Same thing. It's worth doing. It's worth the small fees involved. Okay. So now you should have three very important documents ready for getting your Z visa. You're going to need additional stuff that's going to be sent to you by the company that is inviting you to China. Some official-looking paperwork that you're going to want to bring with you in good order. You're going to want, obviously, a valid passport. You have to have 6 months left on your passport at least. So please make sure you have 6 months at least left on your passport. And some other, other documents that you want to bring with you that, again, usually your job will provide you with. I want to talk a little bit, and this is purely informational, about the idea of working illegally or semi-legally in China. It's actually quite common for foreigners to live in China and to work here and to earn income here without a Z visa. A Z visa in China is actually one of the harder countries to get a working visa for. And so the alternative for a lot of teachers and workers here is working semi-legally or illegally in China. So I'll give you some information. I do want to say that first, before I, because this is an official video, working illegally in China is illegal, and I don't recommend you do it, because the penalty for getting caught working illegally in China is the institution you're working for will be heavily fined. You will be kicked out of the country, and you will not be allowed probably to return to China for 10 years. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that you're going to spend time in jail. You're probably not, although you might spend time waiting for deportation. That being said, it's quite hard to be caught working illegally in China as long as you're reasonably careful. So again, not advocating and not giving you instructions about how to work illegally. I'm just speaking here about how this works and how people do it, just from my own knowledge. So the way a lot of people work illegally or semi-legally in China is what we call here in China the Hong Kong Shuffle. So the most common way, especially for Americans, to work illegally in China is to simply get a 10-year tourist visa. 10-year tourist visas currently are very easy to get. They're the standard visas issued to U.S. citizens. There's a reciprocal relationship with the United States where Chinese citizens are now granted 10-year visas and American citizens are likewise granted 10-year tourist visas. That wasn't the case in the past, and it may not be the case in the future. So typically what happens is someone goes and gets a tourist visa, which is valid for 10 years. It is valid for multiple entries into China, and those entries can last 90 days typically. Again, other visas may be issued, but that's the typical visa that's been issued recently. So if you have that 90-day stay, all you have to do, and a lot of people do this, is step out of the People's Republic of China for like an hour, and then come back in. And the easiest way that most people find in the mainland to do that is to go to Hong Kong, but they could go anywhere. You could go to Macau, which is also an autonomous region of China. You could go to Taiwan. You could go to Korea. You could go to Japan. You could go to the United States. You just leave China and then get stamped back in, and your 90 days starts over again. And then just every 3 months you have to leave. The reason a lot of people go to Hong Kong is it's one of the cheapest options. A flight from most cities in China to Hong Kong might run you around 2,000 RMB, which is roughly $250. So yeah, $250, $270, and that's probably on the high end. So there are some companies that certainly, when they hire workers and they know those workers are here illegally, they just say like, look, we'll let you go to Hong Kong for a weekend every 3 months, and they pay for it. Other companies will say, you're on your own, you got to do that yourself. A lot of people like it because they get to go to Hong Kong, which is a very different place than China in a lot of ways, and a lot more like home. So it's a nice little breath of home, breath of fresh air occasionally. So that's the Hong Kong shuffle. The second way that a lot of people work semi-legally in China or illegally is the business visa. There's actually a lot of people in China legitimately on business visas. For example, if you work for a company that's based in another country, this may be how you're in China because you're being paid by a company outside of China. And then they may issue you a business visa. They may have a company that they're partnered with in mainland China that invites you. A business visa is basically you are here in China not to work, but to exchange cultural information, business information. If you're a businessman coming for 3 months of business meetings or even a week of business meetings, you'd probably get a business visa to do that legally. But a lot of people use this as a way to enter the country and actually work at a regular job. It's quite common. Business visas can be issued anywhere from 3 months to a year. And there's actually apparently a lot of companies in China that make their living solely off of inviting foreigners on business visas who then go work for other companies. So a very common way that people work semi-legally in China is through the business visa approach. To get a business visa, it's much less of a hassle than a work visa. Typically, you get an invite letter from the company, and then you bring your paperwork to the embassy and get issued the business visa. The downside for a lot of folks for business visas is that you can run afoul of the government if you keep getting issued business visas every 6 months. And if you plan on someone who plans to stay in China for a short period of time, working part-time or something like that, and doesn't have like the idea that they're going to stay in China for 3 or 4 or 5 years, the business visa is often the alternative that they take. Okay. The student visa is also popular amongst young folks. It's fairly easy to find institutions in China, both public schools and private institutions that are capable of issuing student visas. Student visas are usually issued for 6 months, maybe 1 year. They allow you to study Chinese or come to school in China. There's sort of 2 different tracks for student visas. If you get one issued by a university, they're going to actually expect you to go to school every day or a certain number of hours every month. There are a lot of organizations, just like the business visa organizations, that essentially will say, we're going to give you a student visa, and we don't really expect to see you in school because our business is to issue student visas so people can come in. So you'll pay a lot of money to that company, and they'll get you the student visa. Student visa is good because you don't have to leave so often, so a lot of younger people choose this option as well. And actually, with a student visa, usually you can get a waiver to work quote-unquote part-time. So it's quite common. If you are employed by a company outside of China and you're paid outside of China, then you technically would not need a work visa in most situations to work here. And that would be, again, the business visa route. So there's a lot of people who work sort of legally here on the business visa because they are employed by a company that operates and pays them outside of China. So there's no paper trail. So how would you get caught working illegally in China? I mentioned it's rather difficult. The Public Security Bureau that's in charge of foreigners, they, for example, in schools, they periodically raid the schools, and they'll say, okay, well, you got 3 foreigners here, show me their work paperwork. And if the company can't demonstrate that work paperwork, then you got a problem. The flip side of that is they don't do that very often, and you might not be working. and very often, what they do is when I say you might not be working, they could say, well, this is my friend. He's just visiting, and he's talking to these kids about stuff. And the other thing about China that is very different from Western countries is the concept of guanxi, its influence, and companies usually know somebody. If they employ foreigners, they know somebody in the police who will kind of tip them off. A lot of these quote-unquote raids are actually, they'll say, hey, tomorrow we're coming into your office to check foreigner permits. And the foreign teachers are told, don't show up that day. And then there's no foreign teachers there who are not on permits. So, again, I don't recommend working illegally or semi-legally in China, but it's a very common practice, especially among European and Americans, workers coming here working semi-legally or illegally. So as you can see, getting a work visa in China can prove to be difficult. The requirements are pretty strict, stricter than many countries. A few things that I do want to clarify. One, the letter of recommendation from previous employers and the 2 years of experience is a relatively flexible requirement in the sense that the company that's interested in hiring you may be able to provide some of that material to you. And again, your level of comfort with engaging in that sort of behavior and modifying your CV is totally up to you, but it's very common that companies will give you a letter from a company that allows you to do that. So it's actually not too difficult to acquire that 2 years of experience, as long as you have the time gap in your record. For example, if you haven't really taught before, or you haven't really taught in a formal setting, maybe you were a coach or something like that, the company may be able to provide you with a recommendation letter, on letterhead that says you did work for a company, and that's again not uncommon. So that may be possible for them still to acquire a work visa for you by, to be honest, making some false statements about your past or your CV. So not uncommon, and if you need some sort of justification for that, I can say that the requirements here are quite strict, and to an extent maybe slightly unreasonable, considering what the people here want from from foreign workers. So if you're applying for a teaching position, your choice. There's a couple other things that you may be wondering about. One thing that is about like a green card. Does China offer any sort of green card program like the United States or other Western countries? And the short answer is no, they don't. You don't really have that option in China. It's pretty strictly controlled in terms of who they let into the country, under what circumstances. There is a new program that's just been launched. If you've lived and worked in China for 5 years, that you may be eligible for a green card, and that is possible. But for someone who's contemplating coming to China for the first time, that's not something that you need to really concern yourself with. The second thing is, what about marriage visas? And marriage visas are certainly possible. If you are married to a Chinese national, you can have residency. If your spouse is not a Chinese national, but they have a work visa in China, then you are eligible for residency as well. But on those marriage visas, you are not legally entitled to work. Again, the controls are pretty strict. So those are two options I didn't talk a lot about, but they're available as well. The last thing I'd like to say in closing is there is a brand new work visa program that is being piloted in some Tier 1 cities. It's being piloted in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and apparently Chengdu as well. This is a brand new program that involves a point system based on your age, your education, and your level of Chinese. So, and that determines whether you can get a work visa or not. So that 2-year requirement issue is sort of fading for some areas. So again, some different options there in the future, and I can talk a little bit more about that program as time goes on, as Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Beijing are actually pretty popular places for foreigners to work. So that new program, in some cases, for some people, may be significantly more flexible, and for other people, may actually make it harder to get a work visa in the future. We don't really know yet. So in future videos, I plan to talk a little bit more about sort of the life of working in China, some things to understand about it, and living here. So I'll give you those videos soon. Thanks for watching. Oh, before I forget, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. It should be right down there somewhere. And if you want to check out the next video in the series, it'll be up here. And if you want to check out some other videos about China, right over there. And then if you want to learn a little bit about anthropology, try going right down there. Thanks again for watching.